Chapter 13 of Bonds, Part 1.
She wouldn't leave us. She wouldn't.
Twilight floated through the drowned avenues of Stalliongrad, suspended in a glowing orb of lavender magic. She scanned the half-buried alleys and the leaning rooftops, her eyes darting between flickers of movement at the corners of her vision.
You yourself found the message. What cause would the Premier have to lie to our own government?
Midnight had elected against projecting herself onto the physical realm for the moment, its cold, almost mocking voice echoing in Twilight's head. Despite this, Twilight could clearly see an image of her dark passenger reclined in the sunlit reading nook of her old study, an untitled book laying ignored on the desk.
I don't know. Maybe it was some kind of power play. Or maybe she must have been misinformed. The princess wouldn't abandon Equestria.
Midnight hummed down at her book with faux contemplation.
Is it really Equestria that you're so concerned about?
Twilight drew up short. Wisps of red energy drifted from her bubble as she fixed Midnight with a tight-lipped scowl.
Of course it is! Everything I've done, everything I've suffered, all of it is for Equestria! True, yes.
Midnight looked up, meeting Twilight's mental glare with her own bloodshot eyes.
But this denial of yours only seems to appear when Celestia does.
Twilight grit her teeth. The butterflies in her chest fluttered about in panic as the pressure around them began to build.
What exactly are you trying to say? Don't play dumb with me, little flower.
Midnight scoffed.
Your foolish worship for your princess does little more than leave us unfocused and vulnerable. We should be focused on feeding ourselves, not mewling over dead alicorns. She isn't dead!
A wave of energy burst from Twilight's horn, slamming into the water outside her shield and obscuring the city in a rush of bubbling heat. The ruins groaned around them, disturbed by the sudden change in pressure, and for several seconds Twilight hovered perfectly still, listening to the distant thuds of rubble sinking down to the streets. Midnight's soft chuckle echoed between Twilight's ears.
Your actions prove my words true, sweet blossom. Don't call me that!
Twilight snapped, her chest heaving.
It's your constant prodding and mocking that's doing this. If you just give it a rest, then maybe I'd be able to focus for once. Curious that the prodding works best when Celestia's involved, isn't it?
Twilight let out a frustrated scream as she pushed herself deeper into the ruins, her eyes scanning her surroundings without really seeing.
You're insufferable! What is it that you get out of this? I seek only our own improvement. It's never my wish to hurt you, little flower.
Midnight's lips parted, revealing a blood-stained smile.
We have only each other, after all. Sometimes the truth hurts. But do we not always seek the truth? We do,
Twilight admitted. Thick red tears began to well in her vision, obscuring the colorless ruins before her.
And that's what we're doing. We'll find more clues in the frozen north, and then we'll have a better idea of what happened, but we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Twilight, have I ever lied to you?
Twilight drew up short. It was the first time she could remember the twisted facsimile of her voice uttering her name. Midnight hovered before her, a calm expression on its bloodied face.
What's wrong?
It asked, cocking its head.
Did you not want me to call you Twilight either?
Twilight found her thoughts wandering as she stared into her own eyes, seeing herself in the reflection. She looked just like Midnight now, didn't she?
You've tried tricking me before.
Midnight gave a soft smile, but shook its head.
When? When you killed Philomena, you tried to make me sleep. You were exhausted.
Midnight's voice was warm, lacking its usual edge.
But I handled the creature, didn't I? As I promised you I would.
Twilight grit her teeth, looking away as blood traced familiar paths over her cheeks.
But I didn't want you to! It was wrong! Perhaps. But did I lie?
Twilight squeezed her eyes shut, throwing herself back into her memories. Surely there must have been one time when her dark passenger had lied to her. It had been in the back of her head for weeks now, whispering into her ears, pushing her to violence and trying to manipulate her. But to her horror, she couldn't think of a single lie it had ever told. It had always been honest with her, perhaps even to a fault. Wouldn't it have been easier for it to wrest control from her if it had presented itself differently? If it had tried to fool her perceptions and fill her head with treacherous falsehoods?
No.
Twilight licked her dry lips, opening her eyes and meeting Midnight's steady gaze.
No. You've never lied to me. Then you know I speak the truth.
Midnight continued.
I'm the voice in the back of your head, Twilight. I can't lie to you any more than you can lie to yourself.
A soft sob escaped Twilight. The endless expanse of the ocean rumbled around her, uncaring.
It's not fair. Don't take it personal, my sweet.
Midnight cooed, brushing an invisible hoof along Twilight's cheek. Twilight flinched away at first, but the chill was oddly comforting to her.
Even one as powerful as Celestia cannot surmount every threat that might oppose her. We can be stronger. We must strive to be so. She wouldn't leave me.
Twilight shook her head, speaking in a quiet whimper.
Rarity saw her. She's still alive. If I can just find her. In time, perhaps. For now, we must hunt.
The cold, ghostly pressure of Midnight's touch drew away, and Twilight looked up to see it floating before her, scanning the settling ruins.
Weakness will invite danger, and we haven't eaten in 2 days. This distraction has already gone on for too long.
Twilight bit her lip as a red tear fell from her chin, sizzling against the barrier below.
I don't want to kill something!
Midnight turned, looking back over its shoulder at her with eyes narrowed.
We ate half a changeling just last week. Are we not over this? It's different!
Twilight snapped, looking up with sudden heat.
We didn't kill that changeling!
Midnight cocked its head.
And we scavenged its body while its blood was still warm.
It paused, looking away in thought.
Though you insisted on draining the corpse before we ate, I'd like to keep the blood this time. How can you possibly not understand?
Twilight asked.
These fangs, these eyes, eating the flesh of another creature. I hate it, but I can bear it. A dead body doesn't feel any pain. But to kill another living being just so I can survive? It's monstrous!
She tried to stop a hoof, but the effect was diminished by the lack of solid ground underneath her.
Who is to say that my life is more important than that of any other?
Midnight arched a brow.
Us, obviously. Would you rather starve when we've come so far?
Twilight's whole body was shaking. She couldn't deny its argument. Some part of her had known that this day would come ever since she first gave in, first bit into the meat of a changeling deep in the bowels of Kennerlot. But she had hoped it wouldn't be today. She had hoped it would never be today. That she would always find some way around it, some way to sustain herself without having to face that undefeatable fact of her cursed existence. She needed meat. and nothing was going to surrender its own flesh without a fight. She paused as a sob interrupted her.
Okay. But I have conditions.
She winced at the piteous tone of her own voice. Midnight regarded her with curiosity.
Name them. First, it has to be a fish.
Twilight began.
No sea ponies, or any other mammals.
Midnight narrowed its eyes.
An odd stipulation, but if it appeases you, then so be it.
Twilight nodded, her voice growing stronger after the small victory.
And we'll be sure to clean up properly.
She shivered as she spoke the next words.
If I'm going to kill something, then I'll do it with minimal waste. Efficiency is always a noble goal.
Midnight nodded.
Is there a third? No.
Twilight took a deep breath, calming herself.
Just those two. We can hunt, but we'll do it.
She bit her lip, looking away.
Ethically.
She could feel the smirk on Midnight's face, but mercifully, it didn't call her out on her word choice.
Very well. Let us return to the hunt, then. We'll have to look harder if sea pony is forbidden to us.
Relief washed over Twilight, followed immediately by a wave of nausea. There was nothing to be proud about. One way or another, some creature was about to die because of her. But it was necessary. She had to survive, so that she could follow the clues, find Celestia, save her friends, and restore Equestria. The death of an ocean creature was such a small obstacle to get caught up on in the face of all the good it would enable. It was too easy. Her shiverings grew stronger as she reminded herself that what she had committed to was not the right decision. No, violence upon another living being could never be right. But it could be necessary. And a small, wrong choice now would allow her to make greater right choices in the future. Perhaps she was surrendering her soul, but how could she not pay such a price when it meant she could set the world back to how it should be? She needed to stop wasting time and energy.
You are just adorable,
Midnight said.
Are you done?
Twilight sighed.
I suppose I am.
It was at that moment that a shadow passed overhead. Or rather, the lavender glow of Twilight's magic, which previously had dissipated into the grayscale of the pitch-black ocean around her, was suddenly being reflected back at her from above. She looked up, eyes widening as she took in the glimmering mass moving above her, and after a brief shock, she finally figured out what it was. It was a school of fish swimming above her, their scales catching her magic and twisting it into twinkling patterns with the flutter of their tails. They danced among each other in a captivating display, each fish in perfect sync with its neighbors, each one unmarred by the bloody signs of corruption that had seemed so omnipresent on the ocean floor.
That,
Midnight observed,
is extremely convenient.
Twilight's ears flicked at the warbling screech of a sea pony, and her open-mouthed awe turned to horror as she watched a trio of the monsters suddenly swim into view, diving in amongst the fish and staining the water red.
No!
She jumped into motion almost without thinking, teleporting into the middle of the school with a burst of magic. The fish scattered around her, and she found herself in the middle of an unbroken sphere of glittering scales as the three bloodthirsty sea ponies turned to face her. She hesitated, and they lashed out with their wild, haunting screams in her ears. She countered with magic, striking them with a wall of arcane force that sent the trio spiraling away with strangled shouts of alarm. For a few seconds, She lost sight of them among the swirling, panicked motion of the fish, but the school was quick to flee, and soon they had left Twilight behind, alone against the three glaring monsters. Twilight blinked. At midnight was in front of her.
Be gone, mongrels! This is our meal!
The sea ponies hissed, flinching backwards as if struck, and backed away. When Twilight floated closer, they gave more ground. The three ponies swam around in circles, their ghostly shrieks filling the water. Twilight kept her eyes trained on them as she backed away, guiding herself towards the school of fish with magical pings. The sea ponies held her gaze with hateful glares, but made no attempt to close the gap. Once she was satisfied that they wouldn't follow, she turned back to the fish, following in their wake. Twilight looked to Midnight curiously.
What was that? They were trying to steal food from us, and I asserted our strength.
Midnight spat.
Not a hard concept even for you to grasp, I would think.
Twilight ignored the jab, pressing on.
But you warned them. You scared them off.
Midnight stiffened, looking away.
What's your point, little flower?
A small smile tugged at the corner of Twilight's lips as she turned to the beautiful display before her.
You could have just killed them.
She followed the school in silence for several long minutes, marveling at the way her hornlight reflected on their scales. What species were they? It had been a long time since she'd read anything on marine biology, and she couldn't recall the exact name, but she was fairly certain they were a coastal species. But what would coastal fish be doing so far from shallow waters? Twilight only barely noticed the ruins fading away around her, giving way to open ocean once more. She cast a simple spell to check her heading and was pleased to find the fish were heading mostly north. Occasionally, she would see sea ponies watching in the distance, as if sizing up the school and its odd guardian, but none of them made any move against her.
I don't like hurting things.
Twilight jumped, having nearly forgotten about Midnight in her reverie, but said nothing. She could feel its mulling over its words inside her, and was loath to shatter the fragile peace she'd found with fresh argument.
It's just the best way to deal with threats.
Midnight paused, and Twilight wasn't sure if it was thinking or hoping for a response.
When something threatens us or our friends, I eliminate it. It is an act of necessity. And those sea ponies weren't threatening us?
Twilight hovered closer, catching a single fish in her magic and bringing it into her air bubble, being careful to bring a pocket of water along with it. She held it up to her eye, her muzzle scrunching up as she racked her memory. A threadfin, maybe?
Their destruction was not necessary.
Midnight spat curtly, remaining unseen.
If they had attacked again, I would have ended them in an instant. Warning them first was just more efficient. Ah, yes. Of course.
Twilight took a deep breath as she watched the fish swim frantic circles in its little sphere of water. Could a fish feel fear, she wondered? Either way, it would be needlessly cruel for her to confine it any longer. She wrapped a tendril of magic around its body, holding it still. With a single thought, she could crush its skull and put it out of its misery. But she could do that at any time, couldn't she? She could wait a little longer.
If that's all right with you? If it helps you.
There was a brief pause, and then Midnight added in a stern voice.
But we mustn't tarry too long. We must reach the frozen north without delay. Right.
Twilight nodded as she relinquished her grip on the lone fish, pushing it back into the open ocean and watching it disappear into the shifting kaleidoscope of its friends.
Thank you. What for? For compromise. It doesn't mean you're weak, you know.
Midnight's only answer was a low growl, and Twilight didn't push the matter any further. Jab, cut, spin, kick, wins. Rainbow grit her teeth. She ignored the complaints from her back muscles as she returned to the starting position. Her wings spread, and the blades fastened tightly to her feathers. Jab, cut, spin, slip, growl. Saber had warned her against starting practice so soon after the fight with the Changeling, but what did she know? Rainbow's knowledge of her own body was intimate, a thing developed over years of rigorous training and dozens of injuries. Sure, she'd never been in the hospital for excessive blood loss before. Most of her extensive experience was with blunt trauma, but she knew when she was ready to get off bed rest. Or at least she knew when she was ready enough that it wouldn't cause any further damage, despite the protests of whichever doctor might be supervising her. Jab, cut, spin, kick, and her hooves flew past the target without making contact. Tail flick. There wasn't a doctor on the Argo anymore. In some ways, Rainbow blamed herself, even if it made no sense to do so. How could she have known that there was a changeling aboard when none of the other crew members did? But she had been the one to find the body. She had been the one flying laps on the lower levels in the middle of the night. If any pony was going to save Dusty Tome from that changeling, shouldn't it have been her? She shook her head and got back into position. That wasn't the kind of thinking that she wanted. That was the kind of thinking that a mare did when she was trapped in a bed, strapped down with wires, and brought 3 meals a day because she was too weak to get them herself. She was a mare of action, and she sought out the soothing repetition of practice precisely because she didn't want that thinking. If Saber wouldn't train her today out of some misguided worry over reopening wounds, she'd do it herself. Jab, cut, spin, kick. Impact, but off-center. She hissed at the pulsing pain that raced up her leg, nearly sending her to the floor, but caught herself just in time. Straightening up with an annoyed groan, she found herself facing the door to Twilight's room. She'd pushed herself hard today. The sheen of sweat stuck to her coat. She turned and grabbed a mug in one wingtip, lifting it to her lips and chugging down 3 big gulps of water. Maybe it was time for a quick break. With another sip, Rainbow stepped up to the thin metal door, gently nudging it open. Princess Luna was sound asleep in the bed that Twilight hadn't used in almost 2 weeks, her face as peaceful as if she were napping in a woodland glade, with only the chirp of birdsong and the rustling of the leaves to lull her, instead of the constant ticking of the walls and the deep, pulsing thrum of the engines. Opposite of her was Twilight's desk, the books and papers left neatly organized just as she had left them when they first arrived in Alta Lucia. Rainbow approached the desk cautiously. She knew the chance of her waking the princess was slim, but it still felt wrong to stomp about in her presence. There was a certain reverence for the desk itself as well. Twilight had left these things where they were for a reason, and she would probably be happy to see them undisturbed if she came back. When she came back. Rainbow's eye passed over the assorted texts with a vague curiosity. What was it that Twilight had spent so many long hours reading in this little room, locked away while her friends fussed over her outside? Thick history books were stacked up under the desk, tall enough to almost act like a fifth leg, and much of the metal surface was hidden behind books held open by paperweights to pages full of mind-numbing texts. She picked up one book at random and flipped it closed. Callus's classified collections on Chiroptera. She arched a brow. A bat-shaped silhouette graced the cover, giving her at least some hint as to the book's contents. She opened it back to the marked page and reached for another book, but this one had no title. The cover was a plain, unbroken purple. With a deep breath, Rainbow opened the book once more and decided to try her mind at the words within.
Dream Journal, 4th of June, 673 Anno Kylie, 3:01 a.m. I'm sinking again. The water is cold and I can't open my mouth to breathe even though my lungs burn. I settle onto the ocean floor and I find myself in the ruins of the Golden Oaks Library. Aloysius is there again, as well as the Griffin and a new character who I believe might be Philomena. It's difficult to remember clearly. The other was there too. It watches from outside, peering into the window with glowing eyes. I can't tell if it takes any satisfaction out of watching me beg for mercy while the Griffin cuts my horn off. There's not much more to record. I don't think the specifics of my babbling are particularly significant, and the Griffin's song is the same as previous entries. I woke up covered in cold sweat, twisted in my sheets. The silent spell has kept my friends from hearing me, thankfully, but I don't know if I'll be able to return to...
Rainbow slammed the book shut and took a step back, shooting a guilty look towards first the open door, and then Princess Luna. The ship tick-tocked away in the background. She had just read her best friend's dream journal. Rainbow shook her head, rushing out of the room and shutting the door behind her. She had known Twilight was having nightmares, silent spells or not. Twilight's magic hadn't been able to hide the jumpiness, the extra cups of tea, or the heavy bags hanging under her eyes in the mornings. Still, to actually read a first hoof account. A shiver ran down Rainbow's spine, followed by a flare of anger as she remembered how Applejack had argued to give their friend the space she requested. They should have pressed harder. She groaned, banging her head against the nearest wall. Stupid! Stupid, 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 stupid! Twilight had needed them, and they'd let themselves be pushed away. And now they might not ever get her back again. She jumped at the sudden hiss of steam behind her. She turned just in time to watch Star Trails step into the cargo hold, smoothing down her drab green uniform with a huff.
Hey, Trails.
Rainbow gave a weak smile.
What's up?
Trails looked over at the Pegasus with a bemused smile.
Have you been practicing on your own, even after Saber told you not to? Hey, I'm good enough for practice,
Rainbow shot back, standing up.
It's just some light exercise, okay? It's not a big deal.
Trails shrugged.
Whatever, Dash. You're the one with super magic healing powers, I guess. Where's your uniform?
Rainbow cocked her head.
You mean the ugly one that made Rarity vomit?
Trails nodded.
Yeah, that one. Find it and put it on. We've lucked out, so it looks like we won't have to go all the way to Alton after all.
Rainbow perked up at that. Anything that wasted less time was good news as far as she was concerned.
What happened? We spotted a merchant lord's fleet on the horizon,
Trails said.
Prince Silverblood's, assuming he hasn't been usurped in the last few years.
Rainbow snorted.
Prince Silverblood?
Trails rolled her eyes.
Hey, once you hit a certain level of rich, you can call yourself whatever you want, and most ponies follow along. But come on, get dressed. We're getting boarded soon, and you need to look like you're on Crazy's payroll.
It only took Rainbow a couple minutes to ready herself. 1 to put away her wing blades, 10 seconds to quickly brush her coat, 50 seconds to find where she had tossed that wrinkled old uniform off to, and another 10 to actually put it on. Soon, the two mares were walking through the halls of the lower level, Trails leading the way while Rainbow peered through the windows in search of the supposed fleet they would be meeting with.
Where is it? She asked. I don't see anything. That's because the ship's pointed at it,
Trails said as they approached the door to Flint's quarters.
Say, do you know where AJ is? She wasn't hanging out in the galley with Flint? Rainbow asked. Or checking the pipes with Sunfeather, maybe? Sunfeather's on the bridge with Saber, and I didn't see Flint anywhere. I figure he's probably taking a nap.
She raised a hoof and pounded on the door to his room.
Hey, Flint, get out of bed, big guy. We're expecting visitors.
There was a heavy thud from within the room, and both Trails and Rainbow let out muted giggles at the sound of his deep-voiced grumbling, muffled by the door. Then a second, higher voice joined in. The door cracked open, revealing a squinting, hatless Applejack.
Y'all raised in a barn, Trails? 'Cause if I didn't know any better, I'd think you had 200 apple trees and need a bucking by sundown.
Trails blinked.
AJ?
Rainbow hissed, leaning in. She frowned as the scent of alcohol wafted out of the room.
What the hey?
I ain't gotta explain myself to you, Rainbow Dash.
Applejack rolled her eyes.
Now, did y'all need something?
Well, we found a ship we can dock with and resupply. Saber wants us all up in uniform to be boarded, so,
Trails looked away, a soft blush on her cheeks.
Pass the message on, I guess?
I heard ya, Flint called from deeper in the room. Just 'cause I'm a bit tipsy doesn't mean I'm deaf.
Right. Great.
Trails nudged Rainbow with a leg as she turned away.
We should go. Well, just hang on, will you?
Rainbow hadn't looked away from Applejack's exasperated gaze.
What are you doing over here?
Rainbow Dash, I am an adult.
But Flint? Really?
Still ain't deaf, Flint called.
Y'all can hush.
Applejack looked over her shoulder for only a moment before turning back to Rainbow.
We can talk about this tonight, you hear? Promise. But for now, we'll be seeing y'all on the bridge.
Rainbow flinched as the door snapped closed in her face. The thud followed shortly by the click of the lock. She looked up to Trails, mouth hanging open, but couldn't find any words.
Not my business,
Trails said, starting down the hall at a brisk trot.
Not my business.
10 minutes later, the crew were all amassed on the bridge. Sunfeather stood in her usual spot on the control dais, hooves idly resting on her levers while Rainbow and the others gathered around Sea Saber on the upper level.
Now that we're all here, our previous plans to resupply at Alton are no longer necessary,
she said.
We've been fortunate enough to cross paths with Lord Silverblood's home ship on its way back south, and he'll likely be willing to trade supplies in exchange for written promise of payment from Mr. Rich. We flagged him down, and there's a picket ship en route now to inspect us before we dock.
Rainbow's eye kept shifting sideways, to Applejack and Flintlock beside her. Had they always stood so close together? Her depth perception was all but gone with only one eye, and she couldn't quite tell if they were brushing shoulders or keeping a more normal distance. She'd seen them getting familiar over cider and stories, sure, but she'd never thought the two would share a bed together. Though if the way Applejack kept her eyes firmly forwards was any indication, she was unwilling to discuss it.
This presents two problems for us,
Saber continued.
First, there's the potential for you two being pressed into his service. A merchant prince like him will have several gifted under his control already, some of which will be on the ship, and they're always looking to gain more. If he's heard of you, and with how long it's been since you arrived, he almost certainly has, then he might try something.
He can try.
Rainbow puffed herself up, her jaw clenching at the idea of some arrogant pony trying to imprison her or her friend.
Wouldn't be the first time I've had to deal with a bounty hunter.
It shouldn't come to that,
Saber said, fixing Rainbow with her stern red gaze.
For the duration of this visit, you'll present yourselves as employees of Mr. Rich. He does a lot of business with a lot of ponies, and Silverblood will be less likely to mess with what he sees to be the property of one of his peers.
Makes sense,
Applejack said. Saber nodded.
Just keep your heads down, don't do anything to stand out more than you already will, and do as I say.
She turned back to Rainbow with the last few words.
You're supposed to be under my command, and ponies might start asking questions if you keep ignoring my orders.
I understand.
Rainbow straightened up, meeting Saber's eyes with a steady expression of her own. She thought back to the lecture Saber had given her after she woke up, wounded from her fight with the changeling.
I won't let you down.
Good. As for the second problem, Saber said, we have an alicorn aboard, and this isn't a smuggling ship.
She paused, letting the words sink in.
If any of you have suggestions about where to hide her, now is the time.
Hide her? Flint echoed. The mirror's huge. It'd be hard enough to hide me.
Maybe we could pull up a grate and squeeze her between some pipes?
Trail suggested.
Or we could put her in the envelope.
Didn't you hear what I said, Trilly? Flint shook his head. Even if we found a gap big enough for her, she'd probably burn up against all the piping. And the envelope, which is full of holes, mind you, is the first place they'll look.
Can we just leave her in Twilight's room? Applejack asked, frowning. Rich has got a good reputation, right? Maybe they won't look too hard as long as we give a good impression.
Saber shook her head.
Not worth the risk. That should only be our last resort.
Rainbow perked up, clapping her hooves together with an excited grin.
I've got it! We can hide her in my room.
Flint arched a brow. Your cloud room? Won't you just fall through? Trails rolled her eyes.
She's an alicorn, you buffoon. Hey, half the pictures of her have her standing on a cloud.
So? Flint countered, shooting a sideways glare at the unicorn. They're pictures. I think the ponies that make them know all there is to know about alicorns.
No, Trails is right, Applejack said.
She put a calming hoof on Flint's shoulder, ignoring the frown it brought to Rainbow's face.
The princess will be fine up on those clouds. The question is how we get her up there.
Rainbow waved a hoof in the air nonchalantly.
No problem. I'll just fly her up. Took me 5 seconds, tops.
Applejack arched a brow, fixing the Pegasus with a skeptical look.
Rainbow, that mare's twice your size, and you're still hurting on top of that. Ain't no way you can lift her up there all on your own.
Oh, yeah?
Rainbow flapped her wings, taking flight with only a slight wince.
Just watch me.
As it turned out, Rainbow realized several minutes later, Princess Luna actually was just a bit too heavy for her to lift. She couldn't even get the alicorn's hooves off the ground. No matter how hard she flapped, how loud she grunted, or how long she talked herself up, the sleeping princess wouldn't budge, and all her back muscles were on fire from the exertion. Then Applejack had pursed her lips, taken a look up at the ceiling, and asked Flint to fetch her some rope. With 2 earth ponies, a firm knot, and a makeshift pulley made by Rainbow threading the rope over a thick pipe running over her little cloud home, they managed to hoist Princess Luna up into the air. Rainbow had been forced to form a temporary hole in her floor for the princess to fit through, and after great effort and several complaints, the job was done. Rainbow leaned against the fluffy bulk of her bed, letting out a relieved sigh before calling down.
There! Problem solved!
Good,
Saber called back.
Now get back down here, they'll be coming aboard any minute.
Right. Just a sec.
Rainbow grinned as she took a moment to admire the results of her labor. Princess Luna was splayed out on the floor at the base of her bed, her expression no less serene, despite the awkward twist to her limbs. Rainbow stepped up and rolled the princess into a more comfortable position, before giving a little nod. That would do for now, and then they could put her back in Twilight's room once they were back on their way.
Wait.
Rainbow blinked, stiffening in sudden alarm.
What if they want to leave her up here? Ah, pony feathers.